Hey everyone, Tactics here with my second last dungeon guide of the War Within Season 1, where this time we've got the returning Shadowlands dungeon, Mists of TIRNA SCITHE. In this video, I'll be walking you through everything you need to know about the important trash mobs and boss abilities, as well as details like how to get through the maze. But if you're looking for either a written resource, a pug-friendly route, or just you want to see what more abilities do, check out my written guides on the Method website or my Mythic Plus ability spreadsheet, which are both linked down in the description below. Otherwise, to get started, I want to first talk about some of the old Covenant bonuses in this dungeon, which have now been converted to allow players to still use them in the War Within. For those that don't know, there's a couple of walls made out of vines, as well as a couple seeds after the first and second boss that previously Night Fae players could interact with, and now this has been changed, allowing any Night Elf, Tauren, High Mountain, Druid, or Herbalists to gain the same benefit. In terms of what you actually gain here, it's a shortcut right at the start of the dungeon, a room full of mushrooms before the first boss that players can interact with to get a 10% stamina or primary stat buff, and then graveyards after the first and second boss. Notably here, the first graveyard after the first boss just before the maze can actually be interacted with by anyone, so no need to have any of those bonuses. That is it for that though. Let's talk a bit about trash here, where immediately you've got these Drust Spite Claw mobs. These guys will jump to a random ranged target with bloodletting, dealing an AoE around them in 4 yards and applying a bleed to any one hit. They will not jump at players within 10 yards though, so what you can do is you can have one player stand away from your group to bait out these jumps while everyone else stacks in melee. When these mobs die, they leave a swirly on the ground that will curse players, so make sure you are avoiding that. Harvesters are the main caster mob in this area, and they have an important channel in Harvest Essence, which deals heavy damage to the entire group, so you want to make sure you are either using an interrupt on this cast or using a CC to stop the channel. They also have a random target bolt ability, which you want to put all your other interrupts into. For tanks, there's the Soul Cleaver mob, and these guys have a pretty nasty debuff in Soul Split. It also applies a magic debuff to the tank, so make sure this gets dispelled. Otherwise, occasionally this mob gains increased attack speed and causes their auto attacks to heal them, so you can either stun them when this happens or start kiting a little bit to reduce the amount they heal. The major lieutenant mob in this area are the Tiernan villagers. These guys have a tank targeted frontal, so tanks make sure you're pointing it away from your group and stepping out of it yourself. And they also will debuff a random player with overgrowth. This channels into them and stuns them after 5 seconds, spawning a vine that you need to destroy in order to free them. If you have any combat drops though, you can do this during the channel to avoid that stun entirely. Just before the first boss, you'll find some Drust Bowbreakers, and these guys will channel Furious Thrashing whenever they are pushed below 50% HP, dealing heavy damage to your group over 6 seconds. So when pulling these guys, try not to push them both at the same time. They'll also just occasionally spawn puddles underneath every single member of your group, so make sure you are moving out of those. Once you get past the bow breakers, you'll be able to take on the first boss, where the boss himself is actually immune for the majority of this fight thanks to the Embrace Darkness passive, which also constantly pulses for group damage. To remove this reduction, you'll need to focus damage into Droman, who at 20% health breaks his mind control and channels Droman's wrath into the boss, causing him to be stunned and take 200% increased damage for 15 seconds. Ideally, you want to make sure you line this up with any damage CDs you may have, just to make use of that amplification and to try and kill the boss as quickly as possible. After that stun fades, the boss will recast his mind control on Droman, and you'll need to defeat him again. However, note that he doesn't immediately regain that damage reduction passive, so you get some time here where you can cleave them both together. In terms of mechanics, Droman has that same frontal attack the villagers had from earlier, so make sure tanks, you're facing him away and you get out of the effect yourself. He'll also occasionally use Tears of the Forest, which spawns puddles near player locations over 6 seconds, so generally you want to try and stay relatively grouped up and then move together to reduce the amount of spread these puddles have. For Ingra, make sure you keep a kick rotation on his random target bolt ability, otherwise his only important cast is Repulsive Visage, which fears your group for 3 seconds. If you have a shaman or a warrior, they can spec into a fear cleanse for your group to help you get rid of that quickly, but if you don't have one of those things, just keep in mind you will always run directly away from the boss when this cast goes out, so try and point yourself such that you aren't getting feared through the puddles that we just talked about. Otherwise, the boss phase and damage jam phase just kind of repeat until Ingra is defeated. From there, you can make your way towards the maze, which has a single correct path through it that changes up each time you enter the dungeon, meaning back-to-back runs don't necessarily have the same correct path. In order to find that correct path, you'll need to use the 4 pillars in each room, which each stand in front of a potential pathway. Standing next to one of these pillars displays an image which can have 3 different traits. First, it can be a leaf or a flower. Second, that symbol can either have a circle around it or have no circle around it. And finally, the symbol itself can either be a filled image or it can be an outline. Your goal here is to find the symbol that has a unique trait that isn't shared out of any of the other symbols in this room. So 4 symbols total. For example, if you have 3 pillars that have a circle around them, but one that does not, then the one without a circle is the correct path, and running into the mist wall in front of that pillar will allow you to continue through the maze. If you ever accidentally run down the wrong path, your whole group gets teleported to the start of the maze, so make sure you're certain on your choice. Now, in terms of what you're actually going to be fighting while in this maze, we've got a bunch of Mist Veil mobs. To start is the Defender, who has a new ability in Mist Ward, which drops a puddle underneath it that deals ticking damage and reduces any Mist Veil mob damage taken by 30%, so tanks want to make sure you move mobs out of this. And other players, make sure you aren't too close to it, because these mobs will also charge and knock back a random target, and you don't want to get knocked into those puddles. Mistveil Stalkers are a pretty dangerous mob in this area, as they have the Mistveil Bite ability, which just debuffs a random player with a pretty nasty bleed, so potentially use defensives or bleed cleanses here on targeted players. For interrupts, there are 2 to be aware of. The first is on the Mistveil Shaper. They will cast Bramblethorn Coat, which puts a shield on a random ally that, when broken, will root all players. So you want to make sure you kick this cast or you purge the shield off instead of breaking it. The other important interrupt in this area is the Mistveil Tender, and these guys have Nourish the Forest, which will just heal all nearby allies for 3% of their max health every second, and you want to make sure, again, this is interrupted. The last major ability in this area is the Anima Injection from the Mistveil Stingers, and these guys will put a magic debuff on a random player that will explode after a few seconds in an 8-yard AoE. So healers, just make sure you are dispelling that effect. Also, in every single maze, you'll face one of 3 potential mini-bosses. So starting with the Matriarch, there's a Tank Buster here that increases your damage taken. There's a random target frontal ability, and there's also a pool that it will place on the ground that will heal anything inside of it, even players, so you want to make sure you move mobs out of it. The Night Blossom mob, again, has a Tank Buster. In this case, it is actually a poison effect, so it can be dispelled. We'll spawn some swirlies as well that you need to avoid. The Frog mini-boss here has a frontal attack towards the tank, which you want to make sure everyone is stepping out of. And then you also will leap to random players, which you want to avoid, and then will do a little AoE around themselves, which again, you want to avoid. After you've successfully made your way through the maze, you'll be faced with Mistcaller, which alternates between a boss phase and an intermission. For the boss phase, Dodgeball shoots a line at all 5 players after a delay, which you need to avoid, and it can be a bit easier to dodge this if you have your group stay relatively stacked, just to cluster all the lines in one area. On top of this, when Freeze Tag is cast, a Vulpin is spawned nearby, and that fixates a random player, stunning them and anyone within 8 yards for 8 seconds if it reaches them. While these mobs can be killed, they also disappear on their own after 14 seconds, so it's often better to just kind of CC them with a long-term CC like Hibernate, or use things like slows and stuns so the targeted player can just safely outrun it or just stay away from it. As a note, knockbacks don't actually work on these mobs, so do not get baited by that. For tanks, you want to make sure you are interrupting every cast of Patty Cake, as it will disorient you, and it can only be interrupted by the targeted player, which is the tank. At 70, 40, and 10% HP, the intermission phase begins with the boss going immune to damage and spawning 4 clones around the room, each with one of those maze symbols above its head. Just like in the maze here, you need to identify which clone has the symbol with a unique trait, and then kill that clone to end the phase. While this is happening, you're also taking ramping damage from Penalizing Burst, so watch your health and use defensives and healing CDs as the phase goes on. From there, you'll be able to jump down the cliff, and there's a bunch of bug mobs to be aware of. The main important one is the Spine Maw Staghorn, which has a bunch of casts to be aware of. First is Stimulate Resistance, which will apply a shield to all nearby bugs, so you want to make sure you are interrupting that, and if needed, you can purge it off of any one hit. It also has Stimulate Regeneration, which just channels healing constantly into all nearby bugs, so again, you want to kick that. And finally, it has the Acid Nova cast. This one is not kickable and just deals a big hit of nature damage to your entire group and debuffs you with a nature damage taken increase, making it very scary to ever pull more than one of these mobs at a time. Outside of this mob, there's kind of a poison dispel in this area, some swirls to dodge, but not really anything super important. Now, after defeating the bugs in this area, you'll find the final boss, which has a pretty interesting mechanic that attempts to learn your movement patterns. Acid Expulsion basically spawns a swirly underneath every player that turns into a puddle on impact. However, each successive cast of this ability will move in a direction based on how you dodged the previous one. So if you just move slightly to the left on the first cast, the next one will move slowly towards the left. Be careful with moving too much here, though, as if you do something like blink or a large movement to avoid a swirly, you'll have these very, very fast moving, almost rocket-like swirlies moving across the entire room, and those can easily take out your party members. Outside of that, Accelerated Incubation spawns 4 larva mobs that just fixate a random player, so use slows and CCs to control these and cleave them down, keeping in mind they do leave behind a puddle on death. The boss also has a bit of a pull-in with Coalescing Poison, which attempts to suck all players into a 15-yard AoE around the boss, so make sure you are running away when this happens. For some more movement, Mind Link will target the tank, tethering them to all nearby players, dealing ticking damage and duplicating the damage that they take back to the tank. Moving 40 yards away breaks this tether, so to make this a little bit easier on your group, you can have your tank stand on one side of the boss with the rest of your group standing on the opposite side of the boss, which actually allows range to pre-position so that they don't even get targeted by the initial link. Other than that, when the boss is pushed to 70% and 40% HP, she runs to the center of the room, gains a shield, and begins to channel Consumption, which spawns swirlies and deals ticking damage every 2 seconds. When this happens, you need to damage down that shield and then interrupt the cast, causing the boss face to just restart as before. But there we have it, guys. Hopefully this guide was useful, and if it was, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content like it, including raid guides and advanced Mythic Plus guides dropping when the season comes out. Otherwise, shout out to all my supporters over on Patreon for making this content possible, and I'll see everyone in the next video.